I am, as always, grateful to Sharon for opening her Beis Medrash to us. She's here watching it all the time. She even sleeps here just to make sure that no one causes it any harm.
Is it disrespectful to interrupt like I just did?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not disrespectful. It's okay.
Mostly, I'm grateful to you. It's so great. We have like a gadol hador here.
Yes.
In this house. So
Yes.
That's a reference to my recent weight gain, unfortunately. But I'll try to bring it back under control. So I would like to thank Sharon for the beautiful welcome, as always. Also like to thank our dear SDC for serving as the convener, or offering me a place, and by offering me a place, offering me a voice, which, as we will see perhaps in a bit, is a very important gift. And finally, to Sharon, who makes the practical elements of all of, to Rina, who makes the practical elements of all of these things come together, both by supplying the text, which you have, and by taking care of the recording element, which allows people either to listen to it after I've put them to sleep in person, or to listen to it if they weren't able to join us here for the actual live learning together. 2 years ago, in the summer of 2016, we began rather optimistically, and I began a series of 5 shiurim, which I hoped at the time would cover the 5 parokim of Eicha and bring together both the common themes and the unique elements of each of the 5 chapters, the 5 great poems which represent the contents of this book. Unfortunately, as I recall now, that summer I took ill with something that left as mysteriously as it came, only it took with it the last 2 parokim, which we never had a chance to study together. And I was wondering why it was that this year, particularly the way the calendar fell out, we were afforded exactly 2 sessions in preparation for Tisha B'Av. And I realized as I went back over the old material that obviously Hashem was beckoning like a kind of a Tisha B'Av Sheni, Pesach Sheni, beckoning me, now that He has been kind enough to let me be well, to complete my promise and to offer those last 2 parokim. Today's discussion will be a rather close reading of the 4th parak. The 4th parak has the particular characteristics which those of you who have suffered with me over a period of time know attracts me tremendously. Namely, its surface is a little bit boring. In other words, if you were to take Megillas Eicha and look at the 5 chapters, you would almost in each of them note some dramatic element, some puzzle of composition that would render it, one of those heart stoppers where you just must explain this. If, however, you were looking for the chapter which seems at first blush to fall most closely under the term generic, it would be chapter 4. Chapter 4 seems to have the elements, the skeleton, if you will, of what it takes to be included in Eicha. It begins with the word Eicha. It follows an alphabetical acrostic, which is the case in all but the last chapter, which, although it isn't alphabetical, has 22 verses. And it partakes of some of the imagery of suffering and degradation that has has had its openings in other places, in other chapters, to great dramatic effect. And yet you ask yourself, when one tries to say something of this chapter, to find something in this chapter which is a unique kind of a trigger, an event, you might at first blush feel frustrated in your effort. Even in its prosody, the fourth chapter is very regular. All of its verses have more or less the same simple double phrase composition. And in terms of its voice, remember we have other chapters which shift between a first-person voice. Sometimes it is the voice of Zion itself crying out. In other words, there is a kind of a florid variety. It's a bit comparable, if you will, to audiobooks. You know, you have some audiobooks where the author reads the entire book in a single voice. You have other audiobooks where the author is a master of dialect, and the shift between one character and the other is intense and dramatic, and you really feel like there's an entire cast making the recording. Well, many of the chapters of Eicha that we have studied have that multi-voice quality. This one, surface, has a kind of a monotone. Its impact is not through that. However, I'm going to argue today that the fourth chapter, in a very subtle way, is one of the most fascinating mechanisms, literary mechanisms, in all of Eicha, and without ever really adopting another voice, but through the very, very subtle introduction of what we would call indirect discourse. In other words, I can keep talking to you, and as I talk to you, I can say that someone told me such and such and such and such. I never really depart from my voice. I'm never quoting them precisely, but it's more like an indirect discourse which has been homogenized in whatever the narrative that I'm offering you is. Let's go to the book itself, and let's begin to put together a sense of the tools that it's using. And I would argue the particular moment where one verse, which seems completely isolated and out of place, may be the linchpin to the understanding of the entire thing. So, Eicha begins, the fourth chapter of Eicha begins with pictures. What do I mean by pictures? I mean highly imagistic language. It begins with Eicha Yu'am Zahav. How has bright gold become dim? Now, it is not talking about some kind of a catastrophe in the jewelry industry where actual gold has lost its qualities. But this notion of gold being changed, Yishna Kesem Hatov, the most beautiful fine gold has been changed. Tishtapechna Avnei Kodesh Berosh Kol Chutzos. And not only has gold collapsed, but even precious stones are being strewn in the street. So what we have here, before we've done anything, this is all metaphorical speaking. It's talking about the loss of the value of things that were always considered to be precious. And the next words in verse 2 are, in a sense, the teacher's manual, right? The answer key to what the first one means, because it starts B'nai Tzion Hayikarim. What are the precious things that have lost their value? B'nai Tzion, the children of Tzion, the children of Zion who were precious. Hamasulaim Bapaz, they were compared to gold. All right? You understand how this, in these two verses, verse A and verse B, serves as the interpretation of verse A. It's very interesting. We always assume that Midrash and Perush are things which mark the next period after the biblical. But we forget that some of these things already were being formulated within the Bible itself. And so here's a perfect example. If verse A, all this gold and precious stone stuff, had been the pasuk, and verse B had been the Rashi, none of you would think that anything was amiss, right? What is Yu'am Zahav? What is Zahav? Zokt Rashi, B'nai Tzion Hayikarim, Hamasulaim Bapaz, who have been compared to fine gold. Echon nechshavu v'nivlei cheres maseh yideu yotzer. How have these most precious elements, what's the nature of gold and precious stones? One discovers them, right? They are in the earth. The human being cannot necessarily create them. They are a wonder of God's hand. And what have they become? They have become no more than the utilitarian pottery, which is basically the lowest form of material in the ancient world. You didn't fix it. That's why you can't kosher china, because essentially it's pottery. And the presumption is that pottery isn't worth kosher. Tell that to somebody with a set of antique Rosenthal china, but it isn't worth. So what does this mean? So it means that there has been a devaluation of the children of Zion. Now, the exact nature of that devaluation still beckons us. Because what do you mean gold has become like pottery? Well, in just, in the next verse, and then developing after that, we're going to introduce what was for much of the Churban, or even more precisely, in its wake, in the wake of the siege that led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, was the main symptom, which was famine. So what happens in a famine? In a famine, things of great value become worth no more than the food you can buy with them. At a certain point, and Hashem Yerachim, we have this very clearly from the experience of Jews in the ghetto, and even in Lo Aleinu V'Lo Aleichem, in the concentration camps. There was no currency in the lager more precious than bread. Bread was what you used when you needed to buy something. Why? Because if you've starved to death, it doesn't help you to have a gold brooch. So when we're talking about this devaluation, that everything has become pottery, we are talking about a world in which all other values have been, so to speak, flattened by famine. Not only what famine does to the human body, which will be illustrated, but by what famine does to the human spirit. Now, as I mentioned before, this chapter has been sort of subtitled, in this particular case by Professor Hillers, a colleague of my grandfather, who wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on the Book of Lamentations. He calls this chapter a survivor's report. In other words, someone assessing what this has done to us. And so this devaluation process, this flattening of everything that was magnificent and worthy of praise, everything that had value, this is the first vision of the survivor. Look what has happened to us. We were once X, and now we are Y. And this then-now mechanism is going to come up a couple more times in even clearer sense as we read on. But let's hold cup, see what's going on. We are now going to introduce what famine does to people. And by implication, it's going to also tell us what was the gold, what was the exalted value of the Bnei Tzion HaYikarim. The exalted value was Kivayachol in their values, in their moral sensibilities and compassion. So what does it say? Gam tanim choltzu shad. When you see this translated in your translation, which is the JPS, old JPS based on the King James, and is accepted by many of the Mefarshim, the tanin or tanim refers to the jackal. The jackal is a kind of an opportunistic carnivore. By the way, interesting note from my recent trip to Israel, although Israel's large carnivores have been virtually exterminated because of human population and the loss of habitat as well as pressure from hunting, so there are virtually no leopards or bears, certainly no lions or cheetahs left in Israel, although there were in biblical times. The great opportunistic carnivore has been the jackal. The jackal has actually extended its range in Israel, partially because the jackal will eat almost anything, including garbage. Human refuse is fattening these little fellows up, and because they are small and not too picky about where they live. So they are able to live in close proximity to human habitation. So, but they enjoyed a poor reputation in the biblical bestiary. In other words, in the culture of the Bible, different animals were presumed to have different reputations. So, for example, in chapter 3, we have the only bear to appear in Megillas Eicha, and the bear appears as the enemy who lies in wait, the sneaky enemy. But in this bestiary, the jackal is particularly thought to have, to be of I guess, low moral standing. But it says, even the jackal, chotzushed heiniku gurehem, even the jackal has enough paternal instinct to offer its breast to its young when they cry out in hunger. Bas ami lachzor, the daughter of my people under the pressure of this famine have become so cruel. Ki kaye'enim bamidbar, they are as thoughtless of their young as are the ostriches in the desert. The thought was that ostriches, which of course are flightless, they lay their eggs on the ground. Their eggs have extremely hard shells, but at least in the biblical bestiary, the ostriches are relatively lackadaisical about caring for their young. When the baby ostriches hatch, they're about as big as turkeys when they hatch, almost. They're on their own, or maybe large chickens. But they grow quickly into turkeys, but they're on their own. There's no such thing as a nursing ostrich, right? That's because they're birds. But there's another interpretation of this, which is even more searing, and it is offered by Rav Sadia Gaon. And it's offered based on the fact that this word tanin or tanim is also a word that we use to relate to giant serpents. And Rav Sadia takes advantage of what must have been an agadic tradition. And, we are used to the idea, those of us who are well acquainted with the story of the Garden of Eden, we're used to the idea that God casts the serpent down to the ground. You are going to crawl on your belly. But midrashically, in addition to losing its legs, the serpent suffered another loss. And according to that midrash, says Rav Sadia Gaon, the serpent actually physically removed its own breasts so that it would not have to suckle its young. In other words, God removed its legs, but in this descent from its near human, mammalian identity, it not only lost its ability to stand, it also ripped out of itself its instinct to suckle its young. It's really a terrifying, and they instead of choltsu shad, instead of saying choltsu to mean extend, it uses choltsu in the sense that we use chalitza, to pull off the shoe, right? So choltsu shed, instead of pulling off a shoe, as in the case of chalitza, they actually pulled off their breast rather than suckle their young. And that is the image that we are moving into. We are now in the hunger verses. And the hunger is the mechanism by which the devaluation and what is being lost here is what are the most primal instincts of concern for another human being. What's the most primal instinct of concern for another human being? The instinct of a mother to nourish her child. Davak l'shon yonek al chiko b'tzama, and the tongue of the suckling child cleaves to the roof of its mouth because it is thirsty. Olalim sha'alu lachem, horeis ein lahem. And here you have the introduction of a theme which is subtle but alarming, because it is the theme of the unanswered cry. That the olel, which is the next step up from being a total infant. I would say that Theo is an olel, right? And he's a child who has learned how to cry out when he is hungry. And in his particular instance, 50 adults immediately convert. And what do you think it is? Do you think he's hungry? Do you think is he tired? Does he need a nap? Is he comfortable? Is he This kid has got more power than the dictator of North Korea. Why? Because when he calls out, there is an entire phalanx of people who are listening and trying to answer the question, what does he need? The verse here is this terrible image. Olalim sha'alu lechem. The little babies have asked for bread, poreis ein lahem, and there is no response. Now this is important for another reason. Why? Because the notion of the unheard prayer hovers over the book of Eicha like a portentous dark cloud, because they've been crying and crying out to God, and He has not really answered. We spoke the last chapter we did, chapter 3, we discussed the interpretation of God's silence, whether God's silence is really a non-response or whether it is actually a kind of response which we are supposed to interpret. That was in that shir. But when we draw the comparison to the little child, it places the adult community in a funny position. They have ceased to hear the cries of their children, and their Heavenly Father, in return or in response to remind them what it feels like, has ceased to hear their cries. And yet they're not making this connection. Okay? So far we are still in the Hunger Games, so to speak. Ha'ochlim limadanim noshamu bachutzos. This is going to be one of the places where we use the then and now. In other words, the suffering of the Bnei Tzion under the pressure of the siege and the famine is the more intense because they have known a lifestyle so much different, so much better. Because we all know that there are always two elements in poverty. There is the objective and the subjective. In other words, a poor person and a rich person subjected to no food for a period of a week are physiologically more or less the same. What's the difference? The poor person is dreaming of his piece of bread and an onion, and the rich person is dreaming of chicken soup with globules of fat and rich sweet challah. Right? One has fallen from here and one has fallen from here. The ground is the same. However, the sense of degradation, the sense of having absolutely nothing, is even more psychologically crushing for the one who has fallen from the lap of luxury, so to speak. And so that's the then and now mechanism that the elegist uses. Ha'ochlim lemadanim nashamu bachutzos. Those who once ate dainty things are desolate in the streets. In other words, they no longer have a home, and in the street there's no nourishment. And then, emunim alei solo chibku ashposos. Those who had been used to scarlet now embrace the trash heap or the dung heap. And here, Rabbi Yosef Kra interprets that a dung heap has a certain warmth. We all know that animal and human excrement has a kind of a fuel. Right? In poor countries, they burn it. And so there's there's heat in the dung heap. But what about the scarlet? Those of you who have been carefully saying Eicha Chapter, Lo siro leveso mishaleg, her house has no fear when it snows, ki chol veso lovush shonim, because she has them all warmly wrapped in fine scarlet wool. So in other words, scarlet wool is considered, it is, in a sense, it is the cultural equivalent to a fine goose down quilt. In other words, it is the warmth with which the wealthy protect themselves against the coldest elements. Right? So the Eicha Chapter is the one who has made sure that every member of her household is in this cozy warmth of the scarlet wool. And now, there's no more wool. There's no more home. And where do they go for warmth? They're embracing the refuse. They're embracing the dunghill. And again, we have the then and now, the contrast of the two images. Then the elegist introduces something. Do you see how cleverly this has been composed? It began with the notion of a degradation. It told us that that which is degraded is the B'nai Tzion Hayikarim. And then it made the degradation explicit by relating it to the results of famine, not only the suffering, but the psychological dimension of the loss of so much which was of value and which gave a sense of status and even more a sense of security. Now another element is introduced very curiously, and that is an historical footnote. You want to talk about episodes of clear, undeniable divine punishment. The clearest prototype is Sodom, right? Sodom, which is overnight turned into a wasteland because of their sins, right? With the angels coming and giving the warning, the angels bringing it about. It's a 1, 2, 3. It is a very neat example. So it's very strange when they say, "Vayigdal avon bas ami mechatas Sodom." The sin of my nation is greater than the sin of Sodom. Because Sodom at least was overthrown in a moment. In other words, the drawn out suffering and degradation, Sodom went from being to not being. And in not being, maybe there was a kind of a comfort and a kind of peace. And it wasn't human hands that fell on her. It wasn't the element of human cruelty, of derision from one's peers that accompanied the Churban and the sorrow that came from it and went to it. Now, remember, let's go back to Professor Hiller's. This is a survivor's account, if you will. And what does the survivor say? The survivor is, at this moment, indulging a very reasonable metric. His metric is that we will measure the suffering. We will measure what has happened and assume more suffering means it was a greater sin. So if we are suffering in certain dimensions more than the people of Sodom, then perhaps what we're saying is it must be that our sin was greater than that of the people of Sodom. This is not, I believe, necessarily supposed to be interpreted in its literal sense. And I recall to you a great piece of chazonus by the great chazan Tzavol Kvartin. And this listening, this way of understanding that particular piece is courtesy of Mr. Milton Steinberg, Shalita. When Kvartin sings from the Slichos, Ashamnu Mikal Am, we are more guilty than any people. He goes back and repeats the verse, but he repeats it in music that should be interpreted. Are we really worse than all the other nations? Can we really assume that the suffering of the Jewish people is because we are worse than all the other people in the world? In other words, it is asked with an ironic question mark. Are you really going to tell us that we are worse than Sodom? In what sense? In the sense that our suffering is protracted and in the sense that our suffering has a social dimension, meaning that we are suffering as members of the family of man. We are being abused by our siblings, as opposed to a direct natural catastrophe coming from God. Now, what we're going to find out as this chapter moves forward, the sense of the suffering of Israel as a social phenomenon in the family of mankind is a subject for careful consideration. Furthermore, as I think I once said at the beginning of our investigation of Megillas Eicha, I don't expect you to remember it, and I wouldn't remember it either, except I happened to listen to a few minutes of one of the tapes just to try to, did I once teach this actually? And one formulation was the message of the book of Eicha, and by extension the whole process of kinos, which are kind of the organic next generation that we'll recite on Tisha B'Av morning. The message of them is that although there is an entire range of responses to suffering, some which wallow in guilt, others which actually indulge in anger against God, all responses are appropriate except silence. And by silence, I don't mean the kind of silence of Aaron HaKohen, where in the face of an event we have nothing to say in the event. By silence, I mean the loss of reflection. Non-reflection is not an option. And once we begin to understand that we are left, the Ribono Shel Olam wants us to talk about our suffering. He wants us to find a voice. And if sometimes that voice is angry, if sometimes it's guilty, and sometimes it's just depressed, it continues to reflect and to digest and to ask questions. That's what makes us different from Sodom. Because on the day after the destruction of the cities of the plain, the days after God's punishment of Sodom, the voice of Sodom is never heard again in the world. There is no one to say, how great is our pain, because it is an utter obliteration. And true, you might say for the people of Sodom, this is a kindness. They are gone. They are forever insensible. They don't have to live with pain. That is the fate of Am Yisrael. But in living with the pain, in continuing to dialogue with suffering, our suffering is of a different species, and ultimately with a different destiny. But at this moment, it feels like to be Sodom would be better. But he continues. So that's this strange moment of historical comparison. Then we have several verses which go back to the then and the now. And this time it speaks about in this couplet in Zion and Ches, it begins with Zaku Nizireha Meshelek. Now Nizireha, how do you understand the word Nizireha? The audience may, if it likes, find its voice. You want to give us, buddy, you want to give us a start? What's Nizireha?
To do with Nazir?
One suggestion, excellent, is that it has to do with their Nazarites. A Nazarite in the sense that a Nazarite is kind of the alpha male of spiritual purification. right, who takes on a whole set of extra strictures and structures in order to reach higher in the search for purity and for holiness. The other reading of Nizirah comes from the idea of Nezer. Nezer means a crown. And so Nizirah may mean her nobles, her rulers, those who wear the crown. In either case, they are compared to Tzachu Mechala. They are more pure in their whiteness than milk. Odmu Etzem Mipninim, and their redness. Now, redness, understand, is gold was considered to be red. It means a kind of a shining ruddiness, right? It's also the quality that was seen in the young David, that he was ruddy. They are more ruddy than rubies in their bodies, and they are as polished as sapphires. So this is what they were. That's the then. Then chashach mishchor ta'aram. And this is, by the way, classic description of someone who has died of hunger. Their face has turned blacker than coal. Lo nikru bachutzos. And they are no longer recognizable when they walk in the streets. You know, that is that terrible, you should never know from such a thing. If there's someone that you've known for many, many years, and lo aleinu v'lo aleichem, they take terribly sick, and you go and visit them in the hospital, and the sickness has so changed the way you look, the way they look. You walk by the room 3 or 4 times. You go to the nurses' stations to see, I came to visit so-and-so, and they're supposed to be in room 153, and I went to 153, and they're not there. And they check the record. Yes, they are. Bed A. Well, which one is A? I know which one is A. Is A closer to the door, or is A closer to... No, A is closer to the door. You mean the person that I saw from the hallway? Hayitachein, is it possible that is what has become of my beloved friend of 40 years? Someone whose face I knew as well as the face that I see in the mirror. And now they are unrecognizable. And that's what the Balakino is saying. He's saying, Lo nikru bachutzos. When they walk in the street, no one recognizes. Now remember, these were either the rulers or the spiritual giants. These were the people who had the highest profile in the community. And now they can walk in the street and no one will stop them because no one recognizes them. Sofad orom al atzamom yavesh haya ke'etz. And their skin is shriveled on their bones. It's like a dry stick. Of course, this is the then and now of the physical appearance of those who in the society represented the standard of beauty, or perhaps the standard of fulfilled humanity. When we speak of when the psalmist speaks of the human being as little less than angels, it is in that, if you ever had the good fortune to be in the presence of a truly holy person, particularly when they are at the height of their joy. I have in mind a friend of mine who was a rabbi and a great scholar, and I remember going to his son's wedding, and the face of my friend, as he appeared at the head of the aisle, as he walked his son, who was also a great Talmid Chacham, to the chuppah, was the most beautiful light that a human face can shine with. And here, the elegist is imagining such people, such lights, with the lights completely turned off. that which was bright rendered dark. And then in Tess, another, if you will, comparison of, the new envy born in the darkness of a catastrophe. All of a sudden you begin to wish you were those who otherwise seem to have met a terrible end. And so he says, Tovim hoyu chalalei cherev michalalei ra'ov. The people who died of the sword were lucky compared to those who died of famine. Imagine people watching their energies ebb and thinking to those who were killed in the first onslaught, "Oy, were they lucky? So lucky that I would take that in a minute compared to what happened to me." Why? And here there's a machlokas in the reading between Rashi and the Ibn Ezra. And listen how subtle this is. The Ibn Ezra says that the shehem, read with me carefully, read with me in the verse. It's bottom of page 1, verse 9, right? Tovim hayu chalalei cherev me chalalei ra'ov. The ones who were killed with the sword are better, luckier than those who were killed with by famine. Shehem, that they. Now, what are our options for that they? Who could the they refer to?
Either one.
What?
Either one.
Either one, exactly. They could be the lucky ones, or they could be the unlucky ones. Who knew? So the Ibn Ezra gives us a straight reading, and he says that they are the lucky ones, because we started with them, Chalalei Cherev. Why are the Chalalei Cherev so lucky? Shehem yozuvu medukarim mitinuvos sadai. Because when they died, they bled with rich, nourished red blood. Why? They died, so to speak, on a full stomach. They died feeling good. Until they weren't, they were feeling great. Rashi says on the other side, and Rashi's tradition is followed by Rav Sadia Gaon, Rav Yosef Kara. He says, no, the shehem is on the unlucky ones. Why are they unlucky? Shehem yozuvu medukarim. Because they ooze out like those who were stabbed, mitinuvos sadai. And what are they? Why are they? When the idea was that when the people died of starvation, their stomachs split open, probably from the gases. And what did it reveal to Nuvos Sadai? That all they had to eat was grass. That to Nuvos Sadai, the plenty of my fields is not referring to the cultivated plenty. It's talking about people who in the end, what they ate made them sick and helped hasten their death. Because they were eating brambles, they were eating weeds. And they died in this degraded state of having the contents of their stomach and their intestines spilling out all over them. As they died disgusting. A neat death with a sword would have been preferable to this. Why? Because one dies covered in blood and the other dies covered in excrement. You don't get a lot more graphic than this. I probably should have rated this for mature audiences and not for people under 13. I hope everyone in here is qualified. I don't want to give you nightmares. Shot of lemon in there, Sharon. Nice. When we get to verse 12, the elegist is going to bring back as kind of his closing of this section of what we might call the horror. to borrow from Conrad. To close this section of horror, he borrows back an image which has been already utilized in the second chapter, which actually in ancient times was a fairly standard image in the various literatures of the Babylonians, etc., and that is the notion of women, the last stage of famine being cannibalism, and a cannibalism which even caused people to ignore their closest relationships. And this is in a sense going to tie back to the images that we had before of the comparison to our detriment to jackals and ostriches and snakes. Noshim rachmonios bishlu yaldehem, the most merciful women cooked their own children, hayulavaros lomo b'shever basami, and they used them for food in the catastrophe of the daughter of my people. Now, this is an interesting verse, because in the Midrash, see what the Midrash sometimes can do is to take a later meaning of a word and insert it back into one of its earlier uses, and to spark a whole new fire of meaning. We have the verb livaros. Literally means to feed, but livaros has a very specific cultural reference, which is, Jeff's going to tell me I know.
I don't know if you're referring to Yosef or Shkor Bar.
No, I'm going later. I'm going into rabbinic literature. If I tell you that it provides the notion of Sudas Havra'ah, what is the Sudas Havra'ah? That is the meal of comfort which is served to mourners. So here you have this crazy image, if you reinsert this meaning, that women are cooking their own children and serving them as a meal of comfort. Vos meilus, there are at least two different ways to interpret it. One is a metric of the terrible, terrible tragedy of the Churban. If a Churban, if the loss of the Beis HaMikdash, the loss of Yerushalayim, if it was such a great loss, such a terrible tragedy, that it completely eclipsed the tragedy of Lo Aleinu, the loss of a child, to the extent that the loss of a child became nothing more than the provision of something to serve to the mourners of the Churban. You're talking about the ability of one tragedy to supplant the possibility of all other losses in the human heart. That's how big is it? That's big. Now, another interpretation, which is midrashic from the Midrash Eicha, we might even have a chance to look at this passage on Tisha B'Av afternoon, tells us, going back to the passage we had, that we're worse than Sodom, because it's Sodom, it says, Lo poshtu yedehem b'mitzvos. The people of Sodom had nothing to do with mitzvos. But the Bas Ami, the Bnei Tzion HaYikarim, poshtu yedehem b'mitzvos. And it's not clear, is that a good thing? It may be a bad thing. What's Pashtu Yedeim B'mitzvos means that they completely lost the ethos of what mitzvos are supposed to be. And here they say quite explicitly, so what happened? In order to give a sudas havra to a neighbor, women took the food away. Not that they cooked their own children. They took their children's food in order to do an act of kindness to the neighbors. The neighbors lost a child, so they took their own children's food, gave it to the neighbor as a sudas havra, and as a result, it brought about the death of their own children just as surely as if they had put them in the pot and cooked them. What does it mean? We are worse than Sodom. Why? Because in our sinfulness before God, we even make use of what were supposed to be sacred mechanisms. The Gemara talks about the Torah as potentially a Sam Hamoves, that the Torah can be poison, that a culture which thinks itself to be a religious culture can be turned on its head, can be perverted to such an extent that in the name, that's why it makes it so, the irony is so powerful, because it refers to Noshim Rachmanios, the compassionate women. They're compassionate. What did they do? They had compassion for the neighbor, but had no compassion for their own children. And why would they favor the neighbor? Probably because some rabbi told them it's a skula for good parnasa. This mitzvah will get you what you want. Do this, and God will favor you. God will make you rich. And it makes them deaf to the cries of their own children. Their humanity, which is supposed to be nourished by the Torah, is instead eclipsed by these observances. And that's why they're worse than Sodom. Because Sodom did not bring about a Chil Hashem. That people, no one blamed the Torah for creating the insensitivity and the evil which was Sodom. But when the Jewish people became at times twisted and almost inhuman, Baruch Hu took part of the hit because it represented the failure to create, the failure of the Torah to create a morally superior community. And so that's what makes them worship Pashtu Yedeim B'mitzvos, because in their evil, part of their armory was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah and mitzvahs. Bad stuff. But now to the verse that I really was very anxious to discuss with you. And then I will speed. Once you've heard this verse, I will be able to speed up the rest. John, could I ask you a favor? Could you maybe get me a little refill on the liquid? Listen to this verse. Ki lo Hashem es chamaso shafach haron apo v'yatzes eish b'tzion v'tochal yisodoseh. The Lord hath accomplished his fury. He hath poured out his fierce anger. He has kindled a fire in Zion, which has devoured the foundations thereof. So I'll ask you a wonderful question. Has God been mentioned up to this point in this chapter at all? All of a sudden, our focus shifts precipitously. All of a sudden, we're saying what this destruction looks like as viewed from the divine perspective. And what is interesting is the Balakina picks up this idea and apparently drops it like a hot potato. There's no follow-up on this verse. Remember how in so many of the other verses, an idea is stated in 2 or in 3 verses, and they kind of layer on one another, even to the point that I was able to compare verses 1 and 2 to a verse and its own Rashi. Right? This one's like a free radical. Where do we go from this? We go in a very interesting place. We introduce another perspective. It's not the sufferer, and it's not God. All of a sudden, this drama has an audience. And the audience is the kings of the world. So a pop quiz question. Can anyone give me an example of where the reactions of the outsiders become part of our narrative? Okay, I'm not going to ask who here davened Shacharis this morning. Exactly. All through the Shira, Oz Nivhalu Alefei Edom, Ele Moav, Yochazenu Ra'ad, we have a careful, almost a survey of how the nations, the surrounding nations, reacted to the miracle of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Right? They were petrified. Well, now we have them reacting to the events in Zion. Only one thing. They only get to read Psukim Aleph through Yud. They don't get to read the pasuk that we just read about God's reaction. What's their reaction? Lo ha'aminu malchei eretz v'chol yoshvei seba ki yovo tzar v'oyev v'shari Yerushalayim. They couldn't believe it. One would say to the other, "Did you see that? I thought you were watching. What was that? Yerushalayim? You know what Yerushalayim is? Yerushalayim is the final settlement of that whole Yetzias Mitzrayim process. They settled into forever the most impregnable city in the world, at least in our imagination of their imagination. Lo ha'aminu. In their book, they're still processing Yetzias Mitzrayim. And all of a sudden, something else has happened. All of a sudden, the foundation of their world of assumptions has just been blown up. How could this be? So what is there? We're going to imagine in a few minutes what their reading might be. But first, the elegist goes inside the Churban, and I'm going to do this a little bit quickly. Mechatos neviel ve'avonos kohanel hashofchim bekirbo dam tzadikim. At the heart of the Churban is the collapse of the moral authority of the prophets and the priests. Now, when we say the prophets and the priests, let me just translate that to you into contemporary colloquially idioms, right? The prophets are, in a sense, the public intellectuals. They are the people who process reality and tell us what to think about it. The Kohanim are the guardians of the great institution. What is the great institution of the Beis HaMikdash? So in any people's corporate life, we have these two elements. We have the leaders who are the public intellectuals, and we have the leaders who run the great institutions, which are supposed to be the flagships of the values of that community. Here it says, all of that collapsed. Suddenly the Jewish people were without reliable public intellectuals, and the institution of the Beis HaMikdash with the Churban was finally put down, but of course it had been corrupted before that. Why? Hashofchim bekirba dam tzadikim. Because they spilled the blood of the righteous. Now the spilling of the blood of the righteous may not be literal. It may be simply exiling them. It may be demoting them. It may be shaming them. There's a lot of ways to spill blood which don't stain your clothes. However, anyone who knows anything either about the 9th chapter of brachos or about the writings of Freud knows that figures of language, when translated into dream, become very literal. Right? So that you can't really understand the images of certain times unless you know the languages. The example I've given you before, right? If you see a painting and it's got little ears on the walls, the only way you can understand that is if you know that there is an expression that says the walls have ears. Right? The language and the imagery are often hooked together. So what happens to this? There's a kind of a metastasis of this image of the blood of the righteous, because it's no ivrim bachutzos. They are blind. Why are they blind? Because they've lost their capacity to render good evaluation. They wander as blind people. Nigoalu badam, and they are disgusting with blood. They've got the dam tzadikim all over themselves. Blo yuchlu yigu bilvushehem. And no one wants to get near them because their garments, in other words, the structures in which they work, everything is polluted with this blood. Suru tome korulama. And people call out to them, get away, you defiled things. Suru suru altigo. Gamnotsu gamno'u. And they fled and they wandered. And here's the interesting thing. I'm going to take a sip of water before I share it. We're going back now to the kings. In verse 12, Lo ha'aminu malchei eretz. So what are the malchei eretz? What is their judgment, right? God has just wiped out the institutions and the public intellectuals. The Jews, so the Amru Bagoyim lo yosufu labor. This people will no longer dwell in their land. The people's finished. The Jewish people are done. Why? Remember how we started? Because there was a non-Jewish equivalent to this also. Vayaminu Bashem uva Moshe Avdo. Up to this point in Jewish history, the relationship with God and Israel relied upon the presence of someone who would be the descendant of Moshe Rabbeinu, or as he himself split it when he stopped being the Kohen Gadol and became just the Melech and Navi, Moshe and Aaron. So the intellectual and the public institutions were always part of it. And now they're gone. Assumption. There's no such thing as Vayaminu Bashem without Uva Moshe Avdo. So the nations of the world have finally decided, we're done. We can do anything we want to them. And in the next verses, this is amplified. Pnei Hashem. That's why I believe that this is still part of Amru Vagoyim, and that's a bit of a revelation, because they say Pnei Hashem chilkom lo yosif labitom. The anger of God has divided them. What's the division? The division between Vayaminu Bashem and Moshe Avdo. Pnei Kohanim lo noso, Zikenim lo chononu. They didn't treat their elders or their priests right. And then we go back to how do we react? As for us, our eyes do yet fail for our vain hope. Because we had allowed ourselves to believe that, okay, so we don't have a covenant with God. So we'll play it straight. We'll be like the other nations. We'll make diplomatic alliances. We'll play the game. And that will be enough. Here, the elegist, whom we assume is Yirmiyahu, is referring to a very particular moment. And that moment is both in the 34th, I think, but certainly in the 37th chapter of Yirmiyahu, when the Egyptian army, there's a siege on Jerusalem by the Babylonians, all of a sudden the Egyptian army shows up. No, the Egyptian army is coming up from Egypt. And the Chaldean army, for a little while, turns away from Yerushalayim and goes to engage with the Egyptians. What does everyone say? Okay, we're good. The Egyptians are going to solve our problem with the Babylonians. And the Navi Yirmiyahu is sent to tell them, don't be an idiot. The Chaldeans are coming back, and when they do, they're going to burn Yerushalayim. But what was this? This was all about the notion that Israel does not have to turn to God. There are alternative ways to make your way in history. And so the alternative way in that moment was to look toward Egypt, and of course to make the greatest mistake that we make all the time. We can't make the distinction between a headline and history. The fact that something is a 4-inch headline in the New York Times does not mean that it's going to change the course of history. It may be a blip, like the moment when the Chaldeans turned away to pay attention for a few minutes to the Egyptians, but the Chaldeans, the subject of God's prophecy, were still the ultimate destruction, and that was our problem, even when we chose to believe it was something else. Not only that, then we discovered something else. There is the assumption that when they would desert the God of Israel, the other nations of the world would receive us with open arms. We're so proud of you for finally breaking your covenant with God. Come, we'll take care of you. And what they discovered was that when they had broken their covenant with God, what greeted them was an even more implacable hatred. Kalim hoyu rodfeinu minishrei shamayim al hehorim dilokunu bamidbar orvu lanu. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles, and they chased us to the mountains, and we couldn't even run away into the wilderness when we